Before we get started, a quick note from me. There are a few other podcasts out there called Control Z, and so because of that, I decided to change the name of this one to make it easier to find. I figure we're 3 episodes in, no big deal. So the show is now called Control Z Rewritten. That's how you'll find us in your podcast app, on social media, and anywhere else we might live online. I really appreciate you being here, and thank you so much for sharing. And now, on with the episode. December 1989. NBC executive Rick Ludwin's office in Burbank, California. On his desk sits a budget spreadsheet for the upcoming season of specials. One of the lines on that spreadsheet is for a Bob Hope television special, already approved, greenlit, and on the way. Ludwin knows Bob Hope. He actually wrote jokes for him in the 1970s. Historically, a Bob Hope special is the safest thing on the page. Older audiences tune in, advertisers show up, the ratings come in predictable and fine, and everyone gets paid. That's what he's about to kill. 5 months earlier, on July 5th, NBC aired a pilot called The Seinfeld Chronicles. The network had already decided not to pick it up. They burned it off on a Wednesday in July because they'd paid for it and they had to put it somewhere. Before the broadcast, NBC's research department had sent the pilot to 400 test households. The memo that came back was not great. No segment of the audience was eager to watch the show again, and nobody really liked the supporting characters. But Ludwin thought it was funny, so he picks up the spreadsheet and he cancels Bob Hope. That money instead goes to a 4-episode order of the show nobody else wants. But what Ludwin just bought with the canceled variety special is 9 seasons, 180 episodes, a finale watched by 76 million people, and a show that completely rewired how comedy gets written. The phone in your pocket right now has words on it because of this decision. Yada yada yada, close talker, Festivus. All of it flows from one guy looking at a Bob Hope line on a budget and deciding to spend the money on something else. But what if he doesn't? What if Rick Ludwin listens to literally everyone else at NBC and lets the show die? Let's hit Control Z and rewrite history. I'm Kevin Perez-Allen, and this is Control Z Rewritten, the podcast where we take the biggest decisions in history and ask, what happens if they go the other way? Not luck, not fate, not what-ifs pulled out of thin air, but real people, real choices, and real alternatives that were actually on the table. One decision where we hit Control Z, try it the other way, and see how history changes. To understand what's at stake in the cancellation timeline, you have to understand what the pilot actually was. Because the show that aired on July 5th, 1989 is not the show that changed television history. To start, there's no Elaine. The female role in the pilot is a waitress named Claire, played by an actress named Lee Garlington. She has one scene at the coffee shop and is never seen again. The character we all know as Kramer isn't called Kramer. He's called Kessler, and the writers describe him as agoraphobic. There's actually a line in the pilot where Jerry says Kessler hasn't left the apartment building in a decade. George is there, obviously Jerry is there, but the chemistry that eventually carries the show is missing 2 of its 4 corners. The pitch wasn't even the pitch we all think it was. Everyone remembers the idea of a show about nothing, but that line didn't actually exist. Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David walked into NBC in 1988 and pitched a show about how a stand-up comedian gets his material. A show about nothing was actually just a joke written into a season 4 episode. So what Ludwin was looking at in the summer of 1989 was a 23-minute pilot with 3/4 of a cast, a confused premise, and no vote of confidence from anyone in the building. The research memo was really the final word. NBC recruited those 400 households, they showed them a plot on an unused cable channel, and collected their reactions. The rating the show got from those 400 households was weak. One executive actually called it a weak week. That's when the president of NBC's entertainment division, a guy named Brandon Tartikoff, delivered his verdict. Too New York, too Jewish. Now, this is worth pausing on, because that line gets quoted a lot without context. Tartikoff himself was both Jewish and from New York. His actual worry was how the show would play in Kansas, and that concern wasn't new. From the 1920s through the 1970s, comedy bookers in the Borscht Belt, that's the network of resorts in upstate New York that served American Jews, had been asking themselves the same question. Which of their comics could cross over to mainstream audiences, and which ones were doomed to stay regional? They had a significant success rate. Mel Brooks, Sid Caesar, Rodney Dangerfield, Jerry Lewis, all of them came up in that circuit before they became household names. Tartikoff's worry was that same worry, just on a bigger stage. The production company that made the pilot, Castle Rock Entertainment, took the show to Fox, a network that at that point was only 3 years old and would have literally taken a sitcom about a half-eaten sandwich if it came with an audience. Even they passed. The show was essentially done. And then Ludwin, a guy who had never worked on a sitcom in his life, canceled his old friend Bob Hope's special and put 4 episodes on the board. Now that's the ending to the real timeline. In every other timeline, including the one that we're exploring, the story stops where Fox passes. NBC's option on the pilot expires on December 31st, 1989. The 23-minute episode that aired as a summer burn-off becomes a footnote, the kind of thing that you find buried in a TV history book next to the pilots for other shows that got aired once and never spoken again. Jerry Seinfeld goes back to stand-up. Larry David goes back to whatever the hell Larry David was doing before Castle Rock called. Julia Louis-Dreyfus never meets them. And Jason Alexander and Michael Richards just take the next jobs their agents send them. And that's the world we're looking at. The one where Ludwin doesn't make the call, and the next 35 years of American comedy grows up around the hole where Seinfeld used to be. The person with the most to lose in the cancellation timeline is Larry David, because by 1989, he was already running out of chances. David was 42 years old. He'd grown up in Brooklyn, graduated from the University of Maryland, and spent most of his 20s and 30s doing stand-up in New York clubs while working odd jobs to pay the rent. He drove a limousine, he sold bras, he worked as a paralegal. He did all the jobs you do when you're a comedian, waiting for the thing to happen. But by his late 30s, the thing hadn't happened. He'd had 2 real shots before Seinfeld, and both went badly. In 1980, he was hired as a writer and a cast member on an ABC sketch show called Fridays. It was kind of a knockoff Saturday Night Live that ran on Friday nights. That show lasted 2 seasons and got canceled. Larry David met Michael Richards there, but that's about all he got out of it. In 1984, he was hired on the actual Saturday Night Live as a writer, a job that is supposed to be the biggest break a comedy writer can catch. David got exactly 1 sketch on the air the entire season. There's a famous story from that year about him storming into the producer's office 5 minutes before the show went live, yelling that he was done, and then walking out. He got home, told his neighbor, a guy named Kenny Kramer, what he'd just done. Kramer told him to go back Monday and pretend it never happened. So Larry David went back, pretended it never happened, and nobody said anything. That incident actually later became the plot of a season 2 Seinfeld episode where George Costanza quits his job in a rage and then comes back the next week acting normal. This is the guy who wrote the pilot in 1989. 42 years old, 2 failed TV jobs behind him, and a stand-up act that comedians loved but audiences didn't. Jason Alexander, the guy who played George Costanza, said that the night they shot the pilot, he had no faith in it. His exact line was, "I think the #1 show in America right now is Alf. If Alf is the #1 show, who's going to watch this?" Larry David left the pilot shoot thinking he wouldn't see Jerry Seinfeld for another 2 years. He thought it was over. In the cancellation timeline, he's right. Larry David goes back to stand-up, back to the odd jobs. By the mid-1990s, he's 48 years old, doing the same circuit he was doing at 38, watching comics 10 years younger than him get specials on HBO. He's the guy other comedians point to at the bar and say, "That guy is the funniest person in this room, and you've never heard of him." He stays that guy for the rest of his career. In the real timeline, after the Seinfeld finale, HBO called Larry David and asked if he wanted to do a 1-hour special. He said yes, but he didn't want to do stand-up. He wanted to do a mockumentary about a guy named Larry David trying to come back to stand-up. That special aired on October 17th, 1999, and it was called Larry David, Curb Your Enthusiasm. I think you know where this is going. HBO turned it into a series that debuted the following year, and 12 seasons and 24 years later, Curb wrapped in April of 2024. HBO calls Larry David in 1999 because he's the guy who made Seinfeld. That's the only reason that call happens. In the cancellation timeline, he is not that guy. HBO doesn't call, and the mockumentary special that became the template for the next 25 years of Larry David's career never gets pitched. Curb Your Enthusiasm is arguably the most influential comedy of the 21st century. That doesn't mean the most watched or the most awarded, but when people talk about cringe comedy, that genre of show where you watch a protagonist dig themselves into a deeper and deeper hole because they can't help being who they are, they're talking about Curb. The show gave American television a working model for how you could build 30 minutes of discomfort out of a single social misstep and make it funny instead of unwatchable. Without that working model, the shows that used it either don't get made or get made in a very different form. And the single rule that made both Seinfeld and Curb possible, the rule that Larry David wrote in the Seinfeld writer's room and carried with him to HBO, never gets articulated in the cancellation timeline. No hugging, no learning. 4 words. Before Seinfeld, sitcom characters had to grow. They had to hug at the end. They had to learn something and become better people. Families reconciled, friends apologized, the audience went home feeling good. Larry David said no. His characters would stay exactly as petty, selfish, and awful as they started. Nobody would learn anything or earn redemption. And that was funny because it was honest. Because actual people also don't change and just age. That rule was the most important thing Larry David contributed to American comedy. And in this cancellation timeline, he never gets the platform to write that down. Now, someone else would land on the same idea eventually because it's too good to stay buried, but without 9 seasons of television proving it works, nobody takes it seriously. Larry David, 42 years old in 1989 and running out of chances, becomes a name that shows up in comedians' memoirs as the funniest guy nobody ever heard of. The ex-SNL writer who couldn't get a sketch on the air, the Fridays guy, a footnote in a book about the 1980s comedy scene cited by people who actually saw him live and swore he was brilliant. Larry David losing his career is the personal tragedy. The bigger loss is the American comedy that never gets built on top of him. Let's start with the clearest case. The British Office premieres July 9th, 2001, created by Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant. Gervais is on his own track. He's a British comic working in British television, and his show happens on schedule regardless of what NBC does with a pilot in 1989. The cringe comedy era still has a launch point, but it's a British one. In the real timeline, NBC bought the American rights to The Office in 2003 and brought it to the air in 2005, with a pilot that was a near-direct adaptation of the British version. Greg Daniels ran the American show. Daniels had come up in comedy writing for Saturday Night Live and then The Simpsons before running the American Office. Some of you might also recognize his name from King of the Hill. The whole American comedy ecosystem he operated in was shaped by what Seinfeld had proven you could get away with on network television. Unlikable leads, no redemption arcs, plots built out of social friction rather than sentiment. Daniels knew how to adapt Gervais for the American audience, partly because the American audience had been trained by 9 years of Seinfeld to watch shows where the main characters never learned anything. In the cancellation timeline, that training never happens. So the American audience of 2005 has not spent the 1990s getting comfortable with the Seinfeld model. So when NBC adapts The Office, they either soften it dramatically to match what the network audiences of that era will actually accept, or they don't adapt it at all because the network doesn't have a reference point for, oh yeah, this works here. That ripple from that single change spreads outward fast. Parks and Rec was created by Greg Daniels and Mike Schur in 2009. It was essentially a spinoff of The Office's mockumentary format. Without a successful American Office, there is no Parks and Rec. Without Parks and Rec, Amy Poehler's career post-SNL looks completely different, and so does the trajectory of Nick Offerman, Aubrey Plaza, Chris Pratt, Adam Scott, Aziz Ansari, and Rashida Jones. On a personal note, it also means I may not be married to my amazing wife because this was the show we bonded over. Mike Schur goes on to create Brooklyn Nine-Nine in 2013 and The Good Place in 2016. both of which are built on top of the comedic muscle memory he developed working on The Office and Parks. In the cancellation timeline, Schur is just a talented comedy writer without the resume that gets him his own shows. 30 Rock, which Tina Fey launched on NBC in 2006, is a meta comedy about a network sitcom writer's room, and the sitcom inside that show is explicitly modeled on the sketch comedy and single camera sitcoms that Seinfeld helped make viable. Fey worked on SNL for 9 years before 30 Rock, and the Seinfeld trained instinct for uncomfortable humor and unlikable characters is all over her show. 30 Rock probably still gets made in the cancellation timeline because Faye's talent is Faye's talent and it's immense, but the network that airs it doesn't have the 15-year track record with edgy comedy that made NBC confident enough to greenlight that show about a neurotic writer and a narcissistic executive. So it likely doesn't happen in that same way. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia premiered on FX in 2005 and is now, I believe, the longest-running live-action sitcom in American TV history. Rob McElhenney, the show's creator, has said in interviews that he modeled the gang on the Seinfeld cast, with the decency dial turned all the way down. In 2024, when Jerry Seinfeld complained publicly that you couldn't make Seinfeld-style comedy on television anymore because of political correctness, McElhenney publicly responded by posting a photo of Rickety Cricket, an Always Sunny character who is a defrocked homeless priest that the show has spent 16 seasons torturing for laughs. The joke he was making is that Always Sunny exists because Seinfeld taught American audiences to root for terrible people, and his show just kept walking in the direction Seinfeld pointed. In the cancellation timeline, the direction never gets pointed. Arrested Development, one of my favorite shows ever, premiered in 2003. And it's the show that people who watched Seinfeld obsessively in the 90s made when they grew up. Mitch Hurwitz, the creator, was steeped in the Seinfeld model of interlocking storylines where every setup pays off 3 episodes later. Veep launched in 2012 and starred Julia Louis-Dreyfus as the Vice President of the United States. She won 6 consecutive Emmys for her role as Selena Meyer, more than any other actor has won for the same role. Armando Iannucci, who created the show, is British and his comedy instincts are his own, but Julia Louis-Dreyfus got the lead because she was Julia Louis-Dreyfus. In the cancellation timeline, she's just a former SNL cast member whose post-SNL career never takes off. So Veep either doesn't happen, or it happens with someone else in the lead, and neither version wins that many Emmys. The list keeps going. You're the Worst, Difficult People, Girls, BoJack Horseman, Succession. All of these shows are built on the proposition that audiences will follow terrible people for terrible reasons and laugh or cry at them anyway. Seinfeld didn't invent that proposition, but it proved it could work on network television in front of 30 million Americans a week for almost a decade. And the difficult protagonist era, the one that runs from The Sopranos through Breaking Bad and Mad Men and everything after, is built on the same foundation. And not because David Chase and Matt Weiner and Vince Gilligan were all just watching Seinfeld for craft notes, but because the network executives deciding whether to greenlight their shows had almost a decade of evidence that an American audience would follow an unsympathetic lead if the writing was good enough. Seinfeld gave those executives the permission slip. In the cancellation timeline, the permission slip doesn't exist, or it exists later and weaker, or it just gets granted by a different show on a different schedule with different results. The comedy that gets made in the cancellation timeline still has hits, but the specific thing that Seinfeld proved, that unlikable people could carry a show and still be the center of an American conversation, either gets proven by someone else years later, or it just doesn't get proven at all. And American comedy spends the 2000s and 2010s making a very different kind of show. The Seinfeld finale aired on May 14th, 1998. 76 million Americans watched it. That number is almost impossible to understand from where we're sitting right now. For context, the most watched scripted television finale of the last decade was Game of Thrones in 2019, which pulled 19.3 million viewers. Breaking Bad's finale in 2013 pulled 10.3 million. Seinfeld quadrupled Game of Thrones' number and came in closer to 8 times what Breaking Bad did. 76 million people all watching the same show on the same night, on the same network, at the same hour, because there was nowhere else to watch it and nothing else to talk about the next day. That does not happen anymore. But that's the monoculture. It existed, and Seinfeld was one of the last shows to benefit from it. In the cancellation timeline, the 1990s monoculture has one less important anchor. Friends still premieres in 1994 because that show really isn't dependent on Seinfeld to exist, but the Thursday night NBC lineup that came to be known as must-see TV loses the show that sat at 9 p.m. and pulled viewers through the rest of the night. Without that anchor, the whole architecture of NBC's dominance in the 90s gets rebuilt around different shows. Frasier launched in 1993 as a Cheers spinoff and would have been fine on its own merits, but the show sat in Seinfeld's shadow and benefited from its lead-in. ER came along in 1994 and was a hit regardless, but the combined power of those two shows gave NBC a Thursday night so dominant that advertisers paid premium rates for an entire decade. In the cancellation timeline, that Thursday night gets assembled from weaker pieces, and NBC's grip on the decade definitely loosens. And the money tells the rest of the story. The first syndication deal for Seinfeld in 1998 generated roughly $1.7 billion in revenue. By 2013, cumulative syndication had passed $3 billion. Hulu paid somewhere between $130 and $180 million for the streaming rights in 2015. Netflix paid over $500 million in 2019. The total career revenue of the show across syndication, streaming, DVDs, and merchandise is somewhere around $5 billion. Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David each renegotiated their contracts somewhere during Seinfeld to about 15%. The two of them have pulled roughly $750 million apiece out of the show, which is why Jerry Seinfeld is a billionaire. Castle Rock Entertainment, the production company that almost gave up on the pilot in 1989, made about $1.5 billion from the series alone. A canceled Bob Hope special in late 1989 ended up producing $5 billion in economic activity over the next 3 decades. In the cancellation timeline, none of that money gets made. Jerry Seinfeld doesn't become a billionaire. Larry David definitely doesn't earn the $750 million that funded his second and third acts. Castle Rock Entertainment, which was acquired by Turner Broadcasting in 1993, doesn't deliver its corporate parent the roughly $1.5 billion in syndication revenue that Seinfeld would eventually generate. This was one of the most profitable single television assets any media company has ever owned. The financial ripple is huge, as you just heard, but the cultural one is even bigger. Because the thing you lose isn't just a television show. You lose an entire vocabulary. Before Seinfeld, yada 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 existed as old slang going back to the 1940s, but it wasn't something people said. After the show, it's in the dictionary. Close talker is a Seinfeld coinage. So is regifting, which is the act of passing along a gift you received to someone else and pretending it's new. Double dipping entered the American conversation from an episode about George plunging a chip into a communal bowl at a funeral. Spongeworthy, Elaine's system for deciding whether a man was good enough to justify using one of her discontinued contraceptives, is now used as a general purpose compliment. Shrinkage became shorthand for what cold water does to some men. Festivus, a made-up holiday from a 1997 episode, is now celebrated unironically every December 23rd by a lot of people who have never watched the show. No soup for you is a phrase parents say to children, and I can say I've used multiple times with my children. Master of my domain is a euphemism understood by people who weren't born yet when the episode aired. A television show contributed more words and phrases to the American vocabulary in 9 years than most novelists produce in a career. In the cancellation timeline, none of that enters the language. Not just the specific phrases, but the cultural machinery that produced them. American conversations in the 2000s and 2010s sound slightly different because there's a layer of shared reference that never got laid down. The specific flavor of Jewish-inflected New York observational comedy that Seinfeld exported to the rest of the country either stays regional, gets exported by a different show, or gets exported later by a completely different medium. Some of it gets absorbed into the culture anyways because language just evolves, but the specific vocabulary we got from Seinfeld is gone. And the monoculture doesn't come back. Whatever replaced Seinfeld in the 1990s had to be a show that 30 million Americans could agree to watch at the same time. And by the early 2000s, that kind of agreement was already falling apart. If Seinfeld dies in 1989, the show, not the comedian, the window to build that kind of audience shrinks. The last great shared American comedy might have been something smaller or something regional, but it was definitely something that didn't travel the way Seinfeld traveled. Or there might not be one at all, and the last great shared comedy of the 20th century turns out to be Cheers. Ludwin bought all of that with one line item on a budget: the comedy, the vocabulary, the money, the Thursday night, the careers, the monoculture. One phone call to cancel one Bob Hope special, and the next 35 years of American television rearranges itself around the decision. Every story about Seinfeld being saved gets told the same way. The right executive saw what the room was missing, and history corrected itself because it had to. But that's not what happened. What happened is that test audiences told NBC the show was bad, and they were right. The pilot is bad. Go watch it. It's on streaming, and it's easily the worst episode of Seinfeld ever made. The research memo wasn't wrong about the pilot. It was wrong about what the pilot could turn into, which is a different question entirely. And the only way to find out what something can turn into is to make more of it. Rick Ludwin canceled a Bob Hope special and bought 4 episodes, the smallest order in the history of American sitcoms. He did this against the unanimous advice of his own research department, the opinion of the president of his own network, and a production company that had already tried to sell the show somewhere else. All because he personally thought it was funny. A guy who had no business making sitcom decisions overruled a building full of professional sitcom decision makers with nothing but his own taste. And he was right. But right is the wrong frame here, because it suggests that he somehow knew. He didn't know. Nobody knew. The show that came out of those 4 episodes was a different show from the pilot, with a new cast member and a new tone and a climb up the ratings. Ludwin was betting on a thing that didn't exist yet. He wasn't right about Seinfeld in 1989. He was right about the idea that a pilot is just a guess at the show, and guesses get better when you make more of them. Now, it's important to note that most of the time this does not work. Most executives who override their research departments get fired pretty quickly. And most comedy writers who are 42 years old and unemployed generally stay unemployed. In every other timeline where an executive cancels a Bob Hope special to fund a show that nobody wants, it doesn't work. It just so happens that in this one instance, it did. The lesson isn't trust your gut. The lesson is that the whole industry runs on people trusting their guts, and almost none of them are Rick Ludwin. And the ones who do turn out to be Rick Ludwin only turn out that way in retrospect. Ludwin himself spent the rest of his career at NBC and never had another Seinfeld. He was right once, at the right time, about the right show, and that was enough to rewire 30 years of American comedy. Decisions don't get do-overs, but on this show they do. If you like the show, please rate and subscribe wherever you happen to be listening. It helps other people find the show and allows me to understand whether people are actually enjoying this. Until next time, I'm Kevin Perez Allen. Thanks for hitting Control Z with me.